Warning, this episode contains graphic content that may be disturbing for some of our listeners.
Whole community is absolutely, beside themselves because they've already had one young boy kidnapped and murdered, and now a second boy, 3 months later, disappears, and there's no sign of him. So everybody is frantic.
Welcome back. Clark Donnelly, along with Jessica Hamelgarn and Harry Trombitas, retired FBI agent. And on this episode of FBI Off the Record, an Agent's Perspective, we are going to look at a very serious series of crimes. It begins in the fall of 1983 in Nebraska, but it extends not just across state lines, but all the way to the state of Maine. Before we begin, though, we want to talk a little bit about, because this topic, the subject matter, can be a little bit disturbing. And Jessica, explain to us a little bit from your point of view as a mom, why things were so different in 1983 than they are now.
Yeah, I want to start with I grew up in 1983. That was kind of where I was born. So I remember this very vaguely. And gentlemen, you can kind of jump in because you were parenting around that time. But as a mom hearing this story now, my first click was, I get notifications from school. I understand what's going on. And so we want to really paint a picture for all of our younger listeners that in 1983, there were no cell phones. There were no parent notifications. It was a lot easier to not know where your child was throughout the portion of a day. Correct, gentlemen?
That's right.
Yep, absolutely correct.
So we want to make that really clear for all of our young listeners who might listen later and say, how did this even happen in 1983 without cell phones, without the internet? It was a very different world.
Right. So let's pick up our story in, as I said, the fall of 1983. While Harry is still training, actually, at the Quantico, Virginia FBI Training Academy, a young boy is kidnapped and murdered in Nebraska. Harry, you get to the Omaha field office. A lot of the agents in your unit are investigating that case, the Danny Joe Everly case. And then all of a sudden, in December, another boy is missing and walking to school, as Jessica just suggested. Left home, went to school, never got there. What happened next?
Yeah, it was a very interesting case. Clark and Jessica, very sad case as well. As you mentioned, Clark, I was in the FBI Academy at the time, going through new agent training. When on September 18th of 1983, Danny Joe Everly and his brother were out delivering newspapers, the Omaha World Herald newspaper, and Danny Joe and his brother kind of split up to divide up the route that they were on. They had 70 some customers that they had to deliver papers for, and so the two boys split up. And when the brother was done, Danny Joe was nowhere to be found. And so the brother went back where he last saw Danny and looked for him, found his newspaper bag laying there with all the newspapers in it, and his bicycle laying on the side of the road or side of the street. So he ran home and told his mom and dad that what he found in that, and mom and dad in turn contacted the Sarpy County Sheriff's Office and filed a missing persons report. And so the Sheriff's Office responded, immediately started looking for Danny Joe Everly, and did a neighborhood canvass. Did everything they could to try to locate Danny, but nobody reported seeing him. Nobody saw anything suspicious. And unfortunately, 3 days go by, and finally Danny Joe's body is found along the roadway in a rural part of the county found in the weeds. He's suffered numerous stab wounds. His neck is cut. He's stripped down to his underwear. His hands are bound together with some type of a unique rope, and there appears to be drawings with a knife made into his chest. And it seems to be covering, one of the knife wounds seems to be covering a bite mark that was found on his body. And so, very gruesome scene. This doesn't happen out in rural Nebraska. The sheriff's office called in the FBI because at the time, before Danny Joe's body was found, it was possible that he was taken out of state. So the FBI is always contacted. And so they were already on the scene, helping out the sheriff's office when Danny Joe's body was found. And so they just continued to work together to try to solve the case. Most of our violent crime squad in Omaha was sent out to try to assist the sheriff's office with the investigation, because once the body was found, it's no longer FBI jurisdiction. It's local, a state jurisdiction matter, because the person kidnapped wasn't taken across state lines, but still the FBI continues to assist. So by the time I arrived in Omaha at the end of October '83, we had already been, assisting the sheriff's office for quite some time. I had been placed on the squad, violent crime squad, to help hold down the responsibilities, all the different violent crime cases that came up while the other agents were out assisting in the investigation of Danny Joe Everly. And so that's the way it went for a number of days, actually over a month or so. We really had no lead, nothing at all to investigate. The investigators put the information all over the news. It was big news in Nebraska. It was carried on every TV station and reported in every newspaper what was going on outside of Omaha in Sarpy County. And yet we just didn't have any answers. And sure enough, on the Friday morning, December 2nd, 1983, I remember this particular day was just a beautiful sunny day. And a young boy by the name of Christopher Walden woke up at his home. His parents were Sue and Steve Walden. Steve was a lieutenant colonel at Offutt Air Force Base, which is in Sarpy County, just outside of Bellevue, Nebraska. And Sue was a stay-at-home mom, and Chris was their only child. He was 12 years old, had blonde hair, blue eyes. Needless to say, his parents just, doted all over him. I mean, he was, the pride, their pride and joy. And they were actually very overprotective of Chris. They would drive him everywhere rather than let him walk. And this made Chris feel a little sad, because he wanted to walk to school like some of his other friends were allowed to do. And I just remember, apparently this one particular morning, it's this beautiful day outside, and Chris is begging his mom, Sue, to let him walk to Pawnee Elementary School, about a mile away. And Sue was very reluctant, but she said, okay, Chris, just go directly to school and you come straight back, at the end of school. You don't go anywhere else. So he was all excited. Chris goes out the door. Sue watches him walk down the street, with his, carrying his books, and he on his way to school, and Sue goes about her business at home, and Steve had already left that morning to go to, his to Offutt Air Force Base for his job, and so he was, unaware that Sue had let Chris walk, but it wouldn't have made any difference. I think Steve would have, agreed that Chris could walk to school that morning because it was so nice out. And so Steve's at work, and now it's getting about time for Chris to be home. School's out, and she's kind of looking out the window. She sees some of Chris's friends walking home, past her house. So she goes to the door and she yells for him to, hey, you guys know where Chris is? And the kid said, we haven't seen Chris all day. And Sue was just shocked. She said, you didn't see him at school? And they said, no, he wasn't at school today. So immediately Sue starts panicking, and she calls the school and confirms that in fact, Chris had not showed up for school that day. He was absent. And, again, this is back in a time where there were no procedures really for when students didn't show up. If somebody didn't show up, the school just assumed that they were sick, or, the family had them at home. There was no real concern about why they weren't in school. And so this was, quite an ordeal, because apparently Chris just never made it to school. So now we have two cases where two young boys have been supposedly kidnapped, and nobody knows where they are. The first child, Danny Joe Everly, was found murdered, his body dumped in a rural area along a roadway, and now Chris is missing. And so the FBI investigators in the Sarpy County Sheriff's Office now have a second case that they need to work on. And I want to mention, I think at this point, in any kidnapping case, law enforcement really needs to open what I would term a three-pronged investigation. Number one, unfortunately, we know parents do kill their children. And that's happened many, many times before. It's unthinkable for most parents to imagine killing your own child, but we have numerous examples of that, over time. And so one of the first things that investigators have to do is eliminate the parents and the caregivers and close relatives of having anything to do with a child's disappearance. So while that's going on, oftentimes that involves a polygraph examination of the parents. Some people can't imagine why law enforcement could think that, someone's own parents or someone's parents would, kill their own child. But again, based on history, and we know that those things happen. So the parents have got to be eliminated as soon as possible. The second prong of the investigation is really to determine if that child maybe ran away for some reason. Was there something going on at home, or, was there something going on that the child wanted to attend, or what is the reason for that child not to be there if they ran off on their own? So a neighborhood investigation has to be conducted. Contact made with all of the child's friends. And, hey, were you aware that Chris was doing anything today? Did you see him? Did you talk to him, yesterday? Did he say he was going to skip school or anything like that? And so there's that part of the investigation that's going on. The third part of the investigation is the neighborhood canvass and the assumption that a stranger may have kidnapped the child. So law enforcement, while these other two things are going on, the ruling out of the parents and the ruling out that the child ran away, um, law enforcement has to determine whether or not somebody in the neighborhood maybe took the child or saw the child being taken, and can provide some kind of lead value for the investigators. So all three of these things have to be going on at the same time immediately, and that's why law enforcement needs so many resources brought into the scene. That's why you have the local law enforcement agency, you have the FBI, you have maybe a state agency providing law enforcement personnel to assist in the investigation, because so many things need to be done right away. And there's a cardinal rule that says, if a stranger abducted a child, and usually that the reason for abducting a child is for sex. But regardless, if a stranger abducts a child, that child is usually dead within the first 3 hours in 75% of the cases. So you've got to move quickly. Time is of the essence in that. So there was probably a delay between when the law enforcement agency was notified. So technically, law enforcement's already behind the eight ball. Some time has already passed, so that clock is ticking. And so much needs to be done right away to eliminate those three possibilities. All of that was done. There still wasn't any lead information about what might have happened to Christopher. Law enforcement put the information up in the media, on TV, Chris's picture. Of course, the whole community is absolutely, beside themselves, because they've already had one young boy kidnapped and murdered, and now a second boy, 3 months later, disappears, and there's no sign of him. So everybody is frantic. This doesn't happen in rural Nebraska like this. So it was, just blanketed the media, both TV and through the newspapers and that. And we had a witness that had seen TV, saw the information about the kidnapping on TV and what the child looked like. And she contacted law enforcement, the Sarpy County Sheriff's Office, and said, "Hey, I don't know if this is it, but I was driving through that area where the boy would have walked to school. And I saw, what I remember was there was that boy that's missing, and a little older boy, not too big. I thought it was his older brother, with his arm around the boy, walking him towards a tan colored vehicle." And law enforcement now had the possibility that this witness may have actually seen the kidnapping take place. So what we wanted to try to do right away was to get a composite of the individual that this witness had seen, and get that on TV, so that the community would have something to look for. Maybe they'd recognize the person that was depicted in the composite. And now I've worked with composite drawings over the years, and they've gotten much better. Now they're computerized in that. But back then, they were really hand drawn. And, the drawing was only as good as what the witness could provide and what the artist could draw. I remember having some composite drawings where they were very good, and if you looked at the composite drawing, you could probably pick somebody else out, or you could pick somebody out. But other situations where the drawing looked like it could have been somebody from Mars. I mean, it didn't even look like a human body. And so, I've had mixed outcomes with these. And the other thing too is when you use a composite drawing, you run the risk that maybe somebody, a witness or somebody has something in their mind, has an idea of who might be responsible. And, for maybe they have some information that seems to indicate this one particular person's involved, but then they look at the composite and they go, oh, that can't be Jim. Jim doesn't look anything like that composite. So I'm not going to bother to call the law enforcement agency because it doesn't look like he doesn't look like the composite. And so I've had that happen. And then I've also, after we've identified who the offender is, and we're now taking him through court, through trial, I've had defense attorneys take that composite drawing and show the jury and say, does my client look like the composite drawing to you? And so, it can cause people to go, no, that doesn't look anything like the defendant.
It's a double-edged sword there.
Oh,
sometimes it's helpful and
sometimes sometimes it's not. So in this case, that was all we had going on. So, they decided to release the composite. And about this time, all three prongs had been investigated. The parents had been eliminated. The neighborhood had been conducted. There was no reason for Christopher to have ran away. So one of the things that is a possibility is that somebody who took the child may want a ransom and call the family and demand cash in return for their loved one. So
is a ransom a common?
Ransom used to be more common. It's not so much anymore unless you have like a celebrity or, somebody who, the bad guys would know has a lot of money. But typically, ransom is very seldom used. Occasionally it does happen, but not so much anymore. So I was sent to Sue and Steve Walden's house to set up the recording, the equipment, so that if somebody did happen to call in to the family, and it was maybe we had number of cases over the years where law enforcement can't find who's involved, so the person responsible, the subject, calls the family and taunts them, or says, oh, the law enforcement agency, and I have your son, or I did this to him, and just unthinkable things. And so we wanted to be in a position where we could record that and use that information to aid the investigation. So I was sent there, technical agent, set up the equipment. I met Sue and Steve. They were an absolute mess. They were, as you can imagine, any parent, absolutely frazzled by, their son apparently has been kidnapped. They don't know where he is. They don't know what's happening to him. I mean, they're a nervous wreck, and they're crying, and I'll never forget, being there when all this is going on with the family, and here I was the law enforcement connection. So Sue and Steve looked at me for answers, and they wanted to know what was going on, and were we making any headway? Were they any closer to finding their son? And I had to in turn relay information from law enforcement back to the family so that we kept them in the loop on what was happening in that. So all this time, a relationship is developing. They're counting on me to provide information, and law enforcement's counting on me to pass along information and to get information on, possible lead assistance. So I'm there, and the way we had set it up was I was there 12 hours. I think it was like 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And then at 6 p.m., we had another agent that came in and went from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. at the home. It happened to be a female agent that came in. And so the two of us would rotate on and off. And while we're there, we're developing a relationship with mom and dad. We're talking about our own families. We're talking about just anything really to take their mind off of the current situation, because every time they thought about what was going on, their son was missing, and that they just start shaking and they were just a mess. And so I did my best to try to keep their minds occupied. And so they started to, I think, look at me as family and, a confidant, somebody they could talk to. Steve would talk to me about his work, his job, things he liked, didn't like. Sue would talk about different things that were going on in her life. We became, what I would say, if not family, certainly good friends while all this is going on. And another thing that would happen is every time the phone would ring, it would literally just startle them so much that they almost jumped out of their skin, because they assumed that, it was law enforcement calling to give them an update, that hopefully somebody had found their son, or, the bad part of it, would be if it was the bad guy that had taken their son and they were calling in to, cause the family some grief and that by, antagonizing them or something. So every time the phone would ring, I would start the recorder. Sue or Steve, whoever was closest to the phone, would answer it. And then they would give me a signal, like, no, it's nothing. If it was a family member or somebody just calling to check on them to see how they're doing. So I would turn off the recorder at that point. So this went on for 2-3 days, where every time the phone would ring, they almost jumped out of their skin. And I was telling them, I was trying to coach them and telling them, you need to try to get some sleep. One of you or both of you should take a nap, get some rest, because we may need you to be alert and give us some instruction on that, on what you want to do in that. So, it's a good idea for whenever you can to try to, sneak in a nap or something, so you're a little more rested and that you can think clearly as we go along. So they would take rotation really, and one would go take a nap, and the other one would stay up and would talk to me and talk about all kinds of things. Steve was a big sports fan, and we talked about the Cardinals and all of that, and he would talk to me about his job at Offutt Air Force Base, and then when Steve went to take a nap, Sue would be talking about her family and the things that she was involved in, and I would try to keep it lighthearted. I'm kind of a goofball anyway, and so I try to look. Anytime I can find some humor in something, I always try to, go there. Not to be disrespectful of anybody, but I just choose to look on the lighter side of things. And believe it or not, I was able to do that a couple of times in this situation, all of it was really intended to, give Sue and Steve a break from the intense worry that they were going through. And I remember one time Sue and I were sitting at the kitchen table, and she was telling me what kind of foods that Chris liked. And, the more that they talked about Chris, the more I felt like I got to know him. Like Steve had taken me into Chris's room and showed me some of his awards he had gotten from being in the Boy Scouts, and some of the awards from school. And I mean, they were very proud of Chris and loved him dearly. And so I was really felt that even though I'd never met Chris, I was really getting to know him. And I remember one time Sue and I were sitting at the kitchen table, and she's nervous and not getting much sleep, and we're talking about our kids. And I talked about one of our favorite things to do was to give our kids Cheerios, and Sue was talking about how Chris liked Cheerios and that, and I said, yeah, we like them because when they're little and they're shoving those Cheerios in and that, if by some chance they start choking, those little holes have, the Cheerios have holes in them, so the air can come through, and it gives us a kind of a whistle, and it lets Barb and I know that we may need to spring into action and save our kid from choking. So,
I never thought about Cheerios that way.
for whatever reason, this hit Sue just the right way, and she bust out laughing so hard. She told me she thought she was going to wet her pants. She was laughing so hard. And for 30 seconds, if I gave her some kind of relief, took her mind off of the terrible situation that they were in, then it was worth it. And so there were other little situations like that where we were able to get a good chuckle out of things, but generally it was an awful situation what they
and
were
it was
going
3 days of it. You're saying 3 days of just waiting.
just waiting, no information. The witness that had seen Christopher, we believe, with another older boy, who the witness thought was probably his brother. She described this individual as about a white male, probably 18 to 25 years of age, about 5'8", 160 pounds, medium build, dark hair, brown eyes. And she said he had some kind of a dark toboggan hat on at the time. And we actually put her under hypnosis to see if there was anything else that she might have remembered, especially about the car that she had mentioned, a tan sedan of some kind. And under hypnosis, she was able to confirm the description she had provided. And she talked about the vehicle, and she was able to give us a digit or two of the license plate number. The problem with that is there were so many license plates throughout the state of Nebraska, that had those letters and numbers in it. It was almost impossible to come up with exactly the right car at the time, but I know we had people working on it. So the news media as well were all over this case. They had camera trucks out in front of the Walden residence. They had them at the sheriff's office, always looking for comments, and they would come to the door, and I had to, kind of steer the media away, saying, mom and dad had no comments at this time, and referring back to the sheriff's office and the FBI for comments. So I was kind of the person that blocked the media from them. And it was a long 3 days. Again, I felt like was part of the family. I felt like I had knew Chris. I know the community was just panic stricken. Parents would not let their children go out and play. They wouldn't let them walk to school by themselves. They'd either drop them off or walk with them. It was just a period of time in the Omaha area where everybody was just on pins and needles, and it made law enforcement kind of feel bad too, because we couldn't find out who was responsible for this. We hadn't found out who murdered Danny Joe Eberly, and now we had Christopher Walden, and we're not making any headway with this case either. And so there's a sense of frustration, not only among the community that we couldn't find them or we couldn't figure this out, but within the investigation, the investigators themselves being frustrated that we're doing everything we can. We just can't figure this out. We're not getting the right lead in that. And so we mentioned that this went on for 3 days. And on the third day, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, there was a phone call to the Walden's house. And I remember, as always, every time the phone would ring, Sue and Steve would just, jump. And this time Steve answered the phone, and apparently it was for me. Steve took the phone and he said, "Hey, it's just a minute." And he told me, he said, "It's for you." So I take the phone, and now I've got Sue and Steve staring at me, seeing if there's any news at all that I can tell them. And my ASAC, Johnny Evans, is on the phone, and he says, "Hey, Harry, I wanted to let you know we found Chris's body. It was in the woods, about 4 miles away from the Walden residence. He'd been stabbed to death." And so Sue and Steve are staring at me. I'm trying not to give any sign about what I'm being told. And Johnny told me, he said, the sheriff and I are going to come over and we're going to break the news to Sue and Steve that we found Chris's body. And he said, I'd have you do it, but they'll ask you 1,000 questions and we have a lot more information than you do, but we want you there when we tell them. So hung up the phone, and I can remember Sue and Steve going, "What's going on?" And I said, "Well, the sheriff and Johnny Evans are coming over, and they want to talk to you." They could tell something was going on. We sat down in the living room, and about a half hour later, the sheriff and the ASAC came to the door. I let them in, and they sat down with Sue and Steve and said, "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but we found Chris's body." And he's indicated that 2 pheasant hunters had been out hunting pheasants and about 4 miles from your home, and they shot a pheasant, and the pheasant fell at the foot of Chris's body. It was actually kind of fortunate because it was snowing at the time, and that Chris's body was almost covered with snow, and the bird just fell right at his feet. And the pheasant hunters went over, saw that it was a body and could see the face and recognized the face as being the boy that they had seen on TV. So they immediately backed away and called the sheriff's office. When investigators arrived, they found Chris's body. He had been stabbed numerous times. His neck had been cut. It was, just a horrible way for anybody to end up, and certainly for a young boy, 12 years old, with his whole life ahead of him, and to end up this way. What monster could have done this? And so it was. You can imagine when Sue and Steve were found that Chris's body had been found. They let out a wail like I've never heard before. I just imagine if you were a parent and somebody's telling you that your child has been found murdered. Imagine, the noise or the sound that you would make, and it was heartbreaking to hear Sue and Steve crying and realizing that their son was had been murdered and would never come home again. And once the news was broken to Sue and Steve, the sheriff and the ASAC asked Sue and Steve if they had any questions. They said not at this point, but they wanted to know. Steve wanted to know if he should come down to the morgue and look at his son, and Johnny said, Steve, that's up to you whether you want to do that or not. But the autopsy is going to be tomorrow morning, and let Harry know if you want to come down and view Chris's body before they start the autopsy. And so he said he would think about it. And so Johnny and the sheriff left, and they asked me to step outside. And so I stepped outside while Sue and Steve were crying inside. And the ASAC told me, he said, the pheasant hunters found the body. It was pretty bad. It was, a lot of stab wounds. His head was, his neck was sliced almost from ear to ear. Ironically, there was two sets of footprints going into that area. So we think Chris was alive, walking with the kidnapper. But only one set of footprints on the way out. So we think that Chris was killed at that location. He apparently was ordered by the kidnapper to remove his clothing. So he took off his clothes except for his underwear. And there was a stack of his clothes that were piled neatly by his feet. Clearly, Chris had been stabbed and cut and had died violently, but hopefully through the grace of God that it was quick, and that Chris's body was found about 3 miles away from where Danny Joe Everly had been found. So, we're thinking again at that point that we've got, based on the activity, Danny Joe Everly was stabbed and cut. Now Chris is stabbed and cut. And the location of where the bodies were dumped, it appeared to be probably the same offender or offenders was involved. So they asked me. They said, would you attend go to the morgue tomorrow morning, meet the medical examiner at 8:45 a.m. So that you can attend the autopsy, and if there's any evidence in that, collect it. And I said, absolutely, I'll head there first thing in the morning. And I went back into the house, and Steve asked me if I thought he should go to the autopsy. And knowing what I knew about Chris's body being, pretty well hacked up, I said, Steve, if I was you, and I said, the choice is completely yours. I would want to remember my son as the last time that I saw him, happy, smiling, just like he usually looked. I said, I don't know that I'd want to go and see my son in that, in a different kind of a condition than what I want to remember. And he goes, yeah. He said, I think you're right. I'm just going to remember Chris the way he looked. And he said, I don't want to go down to the morgue. So Sue felt the same way. She didn't want to go down. So I felt relieved that they weren't going to go down and see the mess that this person had done to their child. So the next morning, I go down to the medical examiner's office to attend the autopsy, and they had me gown up, put coverings on my head, my feet, my body, so I could go in, and I wouldn't leave any evidence in that, any hairs or fibers or anything like that in the autopsy. And so I stood there. The medical examiner, starts going through his routine and, talking about, what he was going to do and all of that. And he started from the top of his head and started working his way down and came to his mouth. And he wanted to do an examination of Chris's mouth. And Chris's neck had been so severely cut that the medical examiner asked me to walk around to the head of the, I guess, gurney or whatever you call that table and hold Chris's head so I could position it in the right position for him to do his examination. So I did that, walked around, and here's this 12-year-old boy, blonde hair, blue eyed, all cut up. I'm sitting there. I felt like I was holding his head on his body. He was so severely cut. I almost thought that he would, his head would fall off his body. I mean, it was like he was almost decapitated. And I'm holding his head in such a way so that the medical examiner can look in his mouth for any signs of maybe like pubic hair or any kind of hair or fiber or anything like that could be evidentiary in nature. Chris had braces, so he wanted to make sure there were no hairs or anything stuck in his braces. And I held his head like that, and then once that examination of his mouth was done, the medical examiner continued down, looking at his wounds, and the wounds were very deep lacerations, and they were contained mostly in Chris's chest and neck area. There seemed to be a star-shaped cutting over what appeared to be a bite mark. If you remember in Danny Joe's case, there was a bite mark with some cutting over it. I'm sitting here looking at this young boy's body and just what kind of monster could have possibly have done this? And we continue on. The medical examiner continues to conduct his examination of Chris's body. Fortunately, there was no indication that Chris had been sexually assaulted, so that was a good thing. And the medical examiner believed that Chris had died very quickly, and so that was good news as well. And so I went back after the examination was done. I went back to the Walden residence, and of course, Sue and Steve want to know, what did Chris look like? How did he die? What all did the medical examiner think happened? And so I wanted to be honest and truthful, but I also wanted to soften the information as much as I could I would not lie to them. That's just not in my nature, but I also don't need to tell them all the gory details. And so they're asking me if I thought Chris suffered. I said no. I said I think Chris died very, very quickly from stab wounds. Um, the medical examiner said there was didn't appear to be any sexual assault. And you know, it, I guess if there was one, positive about that, his son hadn't gone through any kind of a sexual assault before he was murdered. And anyway, they seem to be okay with the information that I told them. And, thanked me for going down there and being there, for them. And for the next 36 days, continue to go to the Walden's house every morning to check on him, give him any updates that I had, and then I would go out and help conduct investigation in that. And we would follow up. We had hundreds of leads, but again, nothing really panned out. But of course, you never know which lead is going to, end of the lead to the resolution of the case. So you've got to follow each and every one out until its logical conclusion. So this went on again, like I said, for about 36 days. And then on January 11th, 1984, we got a break. And that break entailed about a woman that around 8:30 in the morning, she was a preschool teacher that arrived at work at Aldersgate United Methodist Church in Bellevue. She parked her car, and as she's heading down into the building, into her classroom, she sees a young man in a white vehicle sitting there close to where she's parked, and the two of them made eye contact. She goes down into the basement of the church. She's starting to get her classroom ready. All of a sudden, this young man confronts her. He's got a knife and he's threatening her with it. She's able to push him away and she's able to escape, leaves the building. She runs down the street. Apparently, just a few doors down is where the pastor lives. And she's banging on the door and yelling for people to call the police. And fortunately for us, while she was running and leaving the building, she was able to get the license plate number of the white vehicle that she saw that the young man in. And when they called the police, she was able to give them the license plate number. And so the police ran it, sheriff's office ran the information, came back to a Chevrolet dealership. They called the dealership, and the vehicle in question that the lady had gotten the license plate to was a loaner vehicle. It was actually a Chevrolet Citation, and it was loaned out to an individual by the name of John Joubert, who was an Offutt Air Force airman stationed at Offutt Air Force Base, not too far away. Joubert had that car because his tan Chevrolet Nova, which matched the description of the vehicle that the witness had seen, was getting engine work that day. So start putting things together right away. The sheriff's office and the FBI made a beeline to Offutt Air Force Base, to where Joubert was, where he lived in the barracks. They made entry. They found Joubert sitting on his bunk bed and placed him under arrest. During the search of his belongings there at the barracks, they found similar type rope that was used in Danny Joe Everly's, when the offender tied his hands behind his back. So that similar type rope was there. when they investigators conducted a search of Joubert's tan vehicle. And fortunately, the Chevy Nova had not been worked on yet. It had just been brought in. So nobody had touched that vehicle. So it was clean as far as evidence. They knew it had not been contaminated by anybody else. So investigators were able to go in. They found a knife that seemed to be one that could have been used in the stabbings and cuttings of both Danny Joe Everly and Christopher Walden. And the investigators took Joubert back to the sheriff's office and conducted an interview. And after several hours, Joubert admitted that he was the one responsible for killing Danny Joe Everly and Christopher Walden. He fit the description. The vehicle fit the description of what a witness had seen. And so two murder charges are filed against Joubert. And while they're waiting to go to trial, investigators from Portland, Maine, contact the investigators in Omaha and in Sarpy County and said, "Hey, we had a very similar type case of what you guys had, and Joubert lived here prior to, enlisting in the Air Force, and we have a homicide here that very closely matches what you had." And so investigators collaborated, told them exactly what they found here in the Omaha area, and they were able to match up everything with a case out in Maine. So apparently on August 22nd of 1982, while Joubert was living in Portland, there was a young boy, 11-year-old boy by the name of Richard Stetson, that had been murdered very similarly to the way Everly and Walden had been murdered. And that case had remained unsolved until, the attention about Joubert was put on national media and the Maine authorities saw it and put two and two together. And so Joubert admitted that he was also responsible for killing Richard Stetson in Portland. And so now we had three young boys that were abducted and murdered by John J. Joubert, Offutt Air Force Airman. We found out that Joubert was an assistant scoutmaster at a local scouting troop in Omaha, which, apparently he'd like to be around young boys and things like that. So, it was a perfect segue for him into that by being a scoutmaster or an assistant. As I mentioned, Joubert had confessed to all three of the homicides. He pled guilty in July, I think it was July 3rd of 1984, and he was sentenced to death in the electric chair. In Nebraska, they don't mess around. On July 17th, 1996, John J. Joubert was executed in the state of Nebraska electric chair for the murders of Danny Joe Everly and Christopher Walden. And although officially not Richard Stetson, that certainly was put an end to that case as well. So the case is over, but my relationship with the Waldens continues. It continues to this day. And that's one thing I want to mention is just the relationship that's developed between investigators and victims. Fortunately, we had a very positive relationship with Sue and Steve Walden and also with Danny Joe Everly's family. And, that's the way that it should be, but unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't go that way. But certainly in these cases, it was a very positive one, and I still remain in contact with Sue and Steve to this day. They were great people, and I still care about them very much. And so anyway, that's what happens when investigators get close to the victim's family. We want to bring justice to them and hold the bad guy accountable. And I think in this case, I think we did.
Wow. I think we all need a couple of minutes to catch our breath. Harry, since John Joubert was linked to the 3 murders, does that technically make him a serial killer?
Yes.
Okay.
The FBI's definition is 3 or more murders with a cooling off in between. So, a mass shooting would be, somebody walks into an auditorium and starts, spraying bullets everywhere, and a bunch of people are killed at once. That's a mass shooting. Or, spree shooting is like, you got somebody goes to the post office and shoots and kills somebody and immediately runs down to the grocery store and kills somebody else, with no cooling off period. That's typically the way spree shooting is described. But the serial murder is, again, 3 or more homicides with a cooling off period in between. So this definitely fit the description of a serial murder.
Wow. Very powerful story.
And you had you had that confession from Joubert, but
Right.
Had you not had that confession, what are some things that law enforcement is looking for to make connections across cases?
The way crimes are committed, many times individuals that commit crimes, they have what's called, a pattern or a signature, unique things that they do to be successful in their particular crimes. And they're usually unique to themselves. That, it's not, a signature would be, let's say, for example, whereas just a gang member firing and killing somebody on the street, there's anybody could have done that. But a more personal signature kind of thing would be the things that the bad guy did, the subject did, that are unique to that particular case. So it might have been the way that the victim was lured to a particular location, or the type of weapon that was used, the things that were done, maybe a sexual assault, for example, ahead of time, maybe clothing items were removed, maybe a trophy, like something important to the bad guy was removed from the house where the homicide took place, so that the subject could relive that crime again sometime in the future, whether it was sexually oriented or not. It might cause those kind of reactions again. So it's the unique stuff that the subject does. And in this case, with the Danny Joe Everly and Christopher Walden, the abduction, you got a young boy out in both situations in the public area. They're abducted. A similar type car is observed. In Danny Joe Everly's case, his hands were tied, and there was a rope found in the search of Joubert's belongings that closely matched the rope used to tie Danny Joe's hands together. The unique carvings and the cuttings, and that manner of homicide certainly indicates one particular type person had done that. The bite mark and then the star-shaped cutting over the bite mark is certainly unique, and that happened in both cases. So those are the kinds of things that we call, the signature of the individual. It's something personal that they need to do to commit their crime.
All right. Well, Jessica, what are our 3 takeaways from this case?
Well, my first is the number of resources needed when you have a case like this. I was amazed about the 3-prong approach, and it makes a lot more sense why so many people are involved in such a large case. The second, and Harry, please correct me and jump in, but casual observations can also make a difference. That's what I keep thinking about with your first witness and the information she gave you, even under hypnosis.
Yeah, absolutely. Observations. I mean, your observations. And here's the thing. If you had 5 people observe something, you might get 5 different descriptions, and we run across that often in, for example, bank robbery cases. The same robber goes in and robs the bank, but 2 tellers describe him a certain way, and 2 witnesses describe them a completely different way. So, observations are great, but they're not always 100% accurate. So that's why we can't just go out and arrest somebody based on, somebody picking somebody out of a photo array, for example, a group of photos. We need more evidence than that. And so, but observations are certainly key. It gives investigators something to work with.
And my third takeaway is your connection with the Waldens. I don't think I ever saw that coming, such a strong connection with the victims' families. And I kind of thought you had to be removed from the case in order to do well, and you are proving me wrong. And it was really heartwarming and touching to see.
Yeah, I'll tell you, and other investigators will tell you the same thing. I mean, law enforcement, we relate to these things. I mean, we have children, we experience some of these things, and it's heartbreaking. And, we are the means to the end for the victim. I mean, they look at us, they count on us. They can't go out and conduct the investigation themselves. They have to count on law enforcement, and we're committed. The men and women of law enforcement are absolutely committed to bringing justice to the victims and holding the bad guys accountable for what they do. And so there is that relationship that's developed between the victims' families and law enforcement. And you ask probably any homicide investigator or investigator that's worked anything like this, they'll tell you that they still have a close connection with the family. Might not call them every day, but there's that connection. It's just like you have a best friend in high school. You don't see them or talk to them for a long time, and then all of a sudden you see them again, at a reunion or whatever the case is, and you just pick up right where you left off. There's that kind of a relationship there.
Wow. Well, again, this has been a very powerful story to listen to. Jesse, real quick, if folks have enjoyed this episode, where can they go to find more?
You can find us on YouTube, on our website, as well as any podcast streaming service that you listen to.
All right. Once again, FBI Off the Record. From an agent's perspective, on behalf of Harry Trombitas, our retired FBI agent, Jessica Hemmelgarn, I'm Clark Donnelly. Thanks for joining us.
Off the Record, an FBI agent's perspective, is created and hosted by Clark Donnelly, Harry Trombitas, and Jesse Hemmelgarn. Produced by Jesse Hemmelgarn. Stories in this podcast are inspired by Harry Trombitas' autobiography, Dark Places, about his time in the FBI. Music is called Cruise in the Back and is available on Storyblocks. You can find this podcast on all your favorite podcast platforms, YouTube, and on our website.